You're about to meet the innovators and influencers who are restoring the Judeo-Christian foundations of our culture right here on The Patrick Coffin Show.
And now, here's your host, Patrick Coffin.
Welcome to the show. I'm so glad you're here. I am indeed Patrick Coffin. Great topic with a fellow Canadian guest. James Hoggan is the president of the PR firm Hoggan & Associates and the co-founder of DSmog blog. Over the past 2 decades, Jim has earned a reputation as one of Canada's leading public relations professionals. His clients have included groups like the Northwest Cruise Ship Association, A&W Foods, the Vancouver Port Authority, Canadian Tire, Canadian Pacific Rail. I could go on. I want to get straight to the topic, which is his latest book. It's titled, I'm Right and You're an Idiot, The Toxic State of Public Discourse and How to Clean It Up. James Hoggan joins us now from Vancouver. Sir, welcome aboard. I appreciate your time.
Thank you for having me.
Obviously, the title had me at hello. I was driving here in Southern California, and I heard your interview. If I can throw some traffic at my fellow radio pros, Armstrong and Getty. I'm right, and you're an idiot. The toxic state of public discourse and how to clean it up. Eye-catching title. What I'd like to do in our conversation, if I can, is focus on the strategies of effective communication and how different groups begin to kind of ossify their opinions. That's one thing I really appreciate about the book. So how did the idea for the book arise? Where did this, obviously it's a great title, but is this all rooted in your experience in public relations?
It is. I've been in the public relations business more years than I would care to admit. Mm-hmm. I did my first press conference about 30 years ago. Mm-hmm. And when I started in the business, my job was basically to help my clients be more persuasive and get their message out. Mm-hmm. But now more and more what you see is that people are sort of taking public relations to a kind of a Darth Vader level where the idea isn't to persuade, it's basically to silence. Mm-hmm. And it's done through various means, but one of the most common is ad hominem attacks on people's credibility and their intentions. Mm-hmm.
You mentioned the advocacy trap in one of the opening chapters, and right. Develop that a little bit, because that's an important piece of this.
Yeah, so this is something that happens to the good guys. So people who are advocating for something that they feel deeply about, and we certainly want to thank advocates. The history of democracy is built on advocacy from various people. Mm-hmm. And so certainly I don't want to criticize advocacy and people wanting the world to be a fairer and better place. But there's something that happens when people disagree with something that we feel strongly about, particularly if it happens on the front page of a newspaper.
Right.
We very quickly shift from thinking that they're wrong to thinking that they're wrongdoers, and before long we're in a fight between good and evil. And it's almost impossible to find common ground with somebody that you feel is evil. And the problem with so many issues today is we need to work with people we disagree with. The issues are just too big to solve on our own. So the advocacy trap is basically this trap where you become more interested in defeating people who disagree with you than you are eventually you become that way than you are in the issue that you basically started your work
right.
on. So it becomes about steamrolling the opposition and defeating opponents as opposed to fixing a problem.
That reminds me of one of my favorite cartoonists, B. Kliban. I don't know if you remember his cat calendars, Kliban. And one of his cartoons, they're sort of absurdist. They would fit in well with the New Yorker. And one of them is, it's two angry groups facing each other, and everyone is holding placards on either side, and they're obviously yelling at each other. One placard says, people against for, and the other placard says, people for against. Right. So almost in one's zealotry to advocate for one's position, at some point it can flip into being more into ritually shaming the other side and kind of scapegoating them rather than selling your own ideas and let the marketplace of ideas decide which is the more persuasive.
Right. And there's the psychology behind this. There's a woman that I interviewed for my book. Her name is Carol Tavris. She wrote a book called Mistakes Were Made, But Not by Me.
Right. And
she basically, in this book, looks at why it is that we are so reluctant to admit that we're wrong. And what she says is that there are psychological forces at play when someone attacks your point of view, especially when you feel strongly about it and you've spoken publicly about it. These very powerful psychological mechanisms of self-justification start to kick in. She says they're every bit as powerful as thirst and hunger. And so advocates unknowingly often strengthen the people who oppose them by attacking their intentions.
Yeah, as though you can read motives and you've got magical soul reading apparatus and you know why that person just said that when you actually have no clue. They're just words.
That's right. And you're forgetting the fact that it's not only they who could be, unknowingly under the influence of bias, but so could you.
That's what is called stance. Right. This attitudes toward other people or groups that allow us to tag them as, they're one of us or they're one of them.
That's right. And that as soon as, and I think you see this on the climate change issue, right? Where climate change basically has become this, it's not about the evidence, it's not about the science, it's about whether or not people like us believe this. And if you believe in it, you can't be one of us, you must be one of them.
Right.
And as soon as something takes on that kind of what Jonathan Haidt calls groupish righteousness, then these powerful forces, social and psychological, sort of take over and they shut down open-minded thinking. And so you end up getting gridlock and nothing gets done.
And then it can devolve into an argument about who's funding your organization. And if I don't like their agenda, then your data is worthless. Both sides do it too.
Yeah, that's right. And I have to plead guilty to some of that behavior in the past, which is why I found this book such an interesting personal journey. That it really, we have these sort of endless debates about whose facts are bigger.
Yeah.
And really, a lot of the time, what we're not arguing about is facts, but values. And I think we tend not to be as good at finding common ground and acknowledging that the other side may have a valid point of view than we are about demonizing them and polarizing the conversation.
Yeah.
The problem with that kind of polarization is that, Deborah Tannen put it, I think, quite poetically. She said that if you hear a ruckus outside your house in the evening, you'll open up the windows to see what's going on. But if there's a ruckus every night, you basically batten down the shutters and try to ignore it. And so by taking important issues and defining them with extremes, you essentially are sending a message to the public that these are unsolvable problems, and so they turn off.
In the end, people aren't really converted by facts, are they? Or at least not facts alone.
No, I mean, there are certain points. I mean, when you're studying at university, you're more kind of just open to that kind of a process. But outside of the academic, world, certain times in your life when you're studying and kind of you're involved in a sort of an educational process, that people think in terms of not just facts on their own, they think in terms of values. And so there's a kind of emotional values. There's a, I'm a great admirer of the new Pope, in particular because of this encyclical that he just wrote, which in my mind is kind of the epitome of powerful human communications. It's a moral narrative it talks about facts, but it doesn't rely on facts. It's sort of a fulsome what I would call a moral narrative. So
Right.
it's the kind of thing that you might hear from St. Paul. It's the kind of thing that you pick up the Bible to read.
Right. And enjoy the way it's being framed rather than it's not just data being presented, it's part of a story.
Yeah, and because people not only care about what, they care about why.
Yeah.
And so the moral story, the values conversation is the why conversation. Like, why should this be important? Like, we have, one of the things that Pope Francis writes about in his encyclical on the environment is that we have no right to destroy life. We have no right as humans to sort of undermine the life systems that support life on Earth. And that's a sort of a deeply moral message that touches people, and you start to touch people's hearts. You're dealing with something that's far more powerful than facts.
People might be interested to know that his predecessor, now Pope Emeritus Benedict, had begun a document on this. He was also very concerned with care of creation and clearly distinguishing stewardship from domination or a sort of a domineering, scorched earth, if you will, attitude. So Francis has certainly picked up that same baton.
Yeah.
Talk a little bit about the cognitive dissonance involved because we're invested in our own worldviews and it's difficult to shake them. And sometimes when enough facts get presented, framed in the right way, there's a period of confusion. Wait a second. Everything I've always known about X might not be so firm in its foundation. That can be difficult for people to let go of what their family believes, what their tribe believes, what their political party believes, what their professor believes. The idea of cognitive dissonance.
Yes, and it's so it takes on various forms. One of the most powerful is something called cultural cognition. So it's cognitive dissonance in the sense that it's like a tribal set of beliefs that you have come to believe, you and the community that you belong to have come to believe a certain way, and the pressure to not fall out of line with the community is great. And so say you live in the Midwest and you're a barber and you live in a highly conservative small town, and you start to read some information about climate change, and it's not something that your Republican friends take very seriously. There's a whole bunch of pressures economically and socially that would basically discourage you from talking in the barbershop about, maybe there is something to this climate change issue. And it's not just people on the right that have this cognitive dissonance problem. It's also people on the left.
Yeah.
But nevertheless, it's very powerful. And these are things that people don't give up very easily, because not good for business, not good for your social life, if all of a sudden you're seen as kind of an extremist. Now, there's Jonathan Haidt writes about this, and he says that we're designed by evolution to divide up into tribes, into teams, and divide against other teams, and that whole process basically shuts down open-minded thinking. So that kind of a process, that's the thing that I see more and more public relations people practicing, is trying to take evidence and basically infuse a tribal meaning into it. So this becomes something people like you and I don't believe. So rather than trying to convince me and participate in a real passionate debate about something, we basically are tricking people into believing in something that's false.
I guess the prime narrative or a theme that you return to in your book, I'm Right and You're an Idiot, is the climate change debate. But it also applies to other contexts. And one of the things that you touch on is the American political ecology and how in generations past, there was a fluidity. You had Democrats who were nascent conservatives in their worldview. You had Republicans who had differing views from the establishment. Now it seems like the groups have ossified, and the pitchforks have come out. That's not a good thing. I mean, this is the toxicity you're talking about. That's
exactly right, and it's I think of it as a kind of like a purification of ideological beliefs. Mm-hmm. So you don't have people who inhabit the gray, and so it's either black or white. You're either on this side, you're on that side. The problem is that most of our problems inhabit the gray. They are in the gray. They're not just yes or no, right or wrong, facts or no facts. Or life is very complex and very gray, and requires a kind of a conversation that moves from the black and white into the gray. Mm-hmm. And so. And it doesn't mean that you give up your values, but that you're just able to kind of find. That's what common ground means. And you see less and less people who are civil. And the civility, the lack of civility, to me is more a symptom than the real problem. Mm-hmm. But so seldom do you see any political leader or even a business leader saying, my critics actually have a point.
Right.
And for me as a public relations person, I would be willing to bet if you do that at the right time, that you would gain all sorts of support.
Yeah. For
being the kind of person who seems to be open to the fact that they could be wrong.
This is exactly what I've said about the guest experts that I would interview on Catholic Answers Live are the top in their field. They are, if anyone's a know-it-all, this crowd is very, very brilliant. But one of the most powerful things they can say to a caller in life or on the air is, I don't know. I don't know the answer, but together we can discover the answer, or let me get back to you on that. Often it's very difficult for people to say or to want to appear to be vulnerable or ignorant or somehow they'll lose face. But I maintain, as I think you're saying, Jim, that you actually gain face. You gain a level of respect because there's an authenticity to that transparency.
That's right. And, it's interesting because I interviewed the Dalai Lama for my book. Mm-hmm. And he said that, I don't know, a couple of times in the questions that I asked him. Mm-hmm. And I had heard that he was concerned about the impact of climate change on the Tibetan Plateau, and that he was more concerned about that than he was about the relationship between Tibetans and Beijing. Mm-hmm. And I asked him if that was true, and he said yes, he had said that. And he said he's concerned about the permanence of the environmental impact on these big glaciers that are the source of all of these rivers for billions of people in Asia. And so I was asking him some questions about kind of communications for scientists. And it was quite a beautiful moment. And he said, in Tibet, we have a saying that if we fail once, try again. Mm-hmm. Fail twice, again, try. Fail 10 times, try again 10 times. Because when you stop trying, then you fail. But you don't fail. You don't fail until you stop trying. He said that even though so many of these big social problems and political problems that we have they seem impossible, that he said, I have been repeating over and over again my message of compassion for 50 years. And I'm just now starting to see like people are actually listening.
Well, it worked for Edison, didn't it? The famous 10,000 failed light bulbs to get to the one that worked. If he was like me, I'd 4 tries, I'm out of here.
Right. And after, right at the end of this meeting with the Dalai Lama, mm-hmm. the camera basically was shutting off. And it's so funny that these moments often tend to happen after the interview. Yeah. And so we're standing up, and he reached over and put his finger on my forehead, and he said, we like to think the Western mind is more sophisticated, but in Tibet, we go by the heart. Mm-hmm. And I think that's stronger. But so maybe if we take the Western mind and the Tibetan heart and we bring them together, we'll do a better job of trying to fix these difficult problems.
Well, that is the longest 18-inch journey, isn't it? From head to heart and vice versa.
Yes.
Just back to the political sphere for a moment. I remember growing up watching Ronald Reagan interact with Tip O'Neill. And there was a kind of, yes, obviously, they voted differently. They had different political views, but there was a sense in which these two could go to a pub and have laughs and talk and connect as men, with that sort of element of civility which has left the room, seems to me.
Yeah, I just wish that we could have more examples of that today. And not just in the United States, but in Canada and places in Europe. But you just see this kind of, and part of it is based in the way we deal with the issues. If it just is, if the issues are defined by extremes and they're tribalized, then being open-minded about the way that your group thinks is almost seen as like a betrayal. And when it gets like that, the sort of anger and the hatred grows, and there's a kind of a, speech becomes violent almost, and being wrong or admitting you're wrong or admitting the other person is right is just like this foreign thing. And I think we just need to become more familiar with it and ask ourselves, why is it we get so angry when we hear these views that differ from our own?
And that leads to scapegoating, doesn't it? I'm not sure if you're familiar with the writing of René Girard, Girard. He just passed away at age 90-something last year. He wrote a book in 1972 called Violence and the Sacred, and it's an exploration of the scapegoating mechanism in society, how one person will suddenly become the object of derision and hatred. So you have the killing of the king, the crucifixion of the savior, the decapitation of the leader. And it's all this groupthink that takes over. And groupthink's a powerful thing. You don't want to stray from the group. Rooted in what you were saying earlier about tribal identity driving one's worldview rather than facts alone.
Yeah, it is a very, it's interesting because a couple of the talks that I've early on when I was talking about my book to groups of activists, I noticed as soon as I start to actually stray a bit into being critical of activism, you've got to be so incredibly careful. Because it's there, you're stepping on the edge of betrayal, right? You're of betraying your group. That's and I think trying to sort of rough up the conversation in your own community is a good thing. To look objectively and to start to look at some of these these people who are. In fact, it would be very interesting. More and more, I see it online, where you have communities that are highly purified. They're only the left or they're only the right, and every once in a while, someone will come into that community on Facebook or Twitter or whatever it is, and start to and maybe they're from the other community on the right, and just stick out like a sore thumb.
Yeah,
and it's like so incredibly time consuming to, oh God, why do I have to explain this or explain myself, right? Yeah. So it's so much easier to just hang out with people who think like you do, but it's a very dangerous thing.
Well, yeah, and if you begin attacking activism, be careful because most of us are activists for our own agenda.
That's right. That's right. I don't think it's funny. I used to think of activists in the environmental community as environmentalists, but there are people who work for industry and government who are every bit as much an activist as the environmentalists.
Have you seen? It's a clip on Facebook's going around virally. It's a social experiment and involves a young girl, maybe early 20s, and she's in a waiting room for some kind of optician office. It's hard to tell what it is. There's a receptionist, and she's surrounded by a row of other people also waiting to go in. And randomly, about 10 seconds in, everyone stands. And then they sit down, and she camera's on her. What? Why did that just happen? 10 seconds later, everyone stands and they sit again. Now, all of them are actors, except for her. On the third time or so, she also stands with them and sits down. And one by one, they go into their appointments and they're never seen again. At the end, they fast forward it so you don't have to listen. You don't have to watch the whole process. But at the end, she's the only one there, and 2 new people come in, also actors. She stands.
Wow. She's
establishing this pattern. Now, we like to, when I looked at that, I thought, well, that's so silly. I would never do that. I'm not so sure I don't know how I would deal with that. It goes to the power of groupthink and not wanting to stand out like that purple cow, right?
Right. Yeah, you see, I certainly see it in the environmental community. There's a certain way that people look at, and there's a lot of reason. There's a lot of reasonable people. These are not foolish people. These are people who care deeply about something, and they feel there are other groups in society who are basically trying to fight those interests. So as they try to protect, some kind of species or, fish on the coast or water or something like that, mm-hmm. that there are other interests that are actively trying to attack them. And it's true. And so when you end up in this kind of war, then there's a kind of you take a warlike approach, there's an unyielding one-sidedness to the conversation. And it all becomes about winning the debate. And dialogue is kind of fades into the back.
Yeah, so your interlocutor, your debate partner becomes the devil. You have to slay the devil. Hence, I'm not sure where this comes from, but have you heard the story of the White Knight? The White Knight travels the world trying to rid it of darkness, and he wants to kill all the Black Knights. But over time, all his adventures tarnish his armor, so he actually becomes a Dark Knight. The very thing he set out to destroy, he becomes in his zealotry. I think it's a temptation for all of us to kind of keep in check.
It's interesting. We in this process of writing the book, I met a fellow named Thich Nhat Hanh, who's a Zen Buddhist monk from Vietnam. He was a friend of Martin Luther King's. He's an older guy now. Mm-hmm. But David Suzuki, who's a Canadian scientist and environmentalist, and I sat down with him for an afternoon, and we were talking about environmental issues. And he said he was talking about how about the inner ecology, mm-hmm. and how we, you don't need to tell people they're destroying the planet. They already know they're destroying the planet. You need to deal with the despair that people feel. And he was talking about the importance of bringing a sort of a spiritual practice into the work on environment. And so I said to him, so you're not saying that environmentalists shouldn't be activists, are you? Because that doesn't, I was thinking it was a kind of a critical question. And he looked at me and he said, speak the truth, but not to punish.
Mm. Oh, that's good.
And I remember thinking, whoa, that is such a, I walked off the stage. This thing was being filmed. I was walking off the stage, and my wife, who was sitting in the front row, said, okay, you heard what he said, right?
Yeah, right.
You heard what he said. Speak the truth, mm-hmm. but not to punish. And I really took that very personally, because I don't know where it comes from, but I've got some of that in me. I wish I didn't.
Yeah, me too. Despite the fact that I'm Canadian and I'm pathologically nice, it's there. It's there in seed.
I don't know what it is, but it's not a good thing.
Yeah. Jim, talk a little bit about how the YouTubeification of public discourse has worsened or bettered things. I'm thinking about all of the clips that I get sent, and more in the last couple of years, I've noticed that I won't be sent a debate. I'll be sent a clip that's tagged like something like this: watch public figure X destroy the other guy, or so-and-so slaughters. This language of murderous vitriol, instead of, well, okay, I have a disagreement with him. We have differing principles and we disagree, But everything is couched now in warfare, scorched earth, absolute winner and an absolute vanquished.
Right. Yes, and there's a fellow that I interviewed. His name is Jason Stanley. He's a very interesting guy. He teaches philosophy of language at Yale. Mm-hmm. And he just wrote a book called How Propaganda Works. Yep. And anyway, when I interviewed him, he talked about something he called silencing. Mm-hmm. And it took me a while to understand it. He's kind of a complicated guy. But I think what he was saying is that when you attack somebody, when you launch an ad hominem attack on someone, whatever it is, there's just these personal attacks. He says that they're not actually the mechanism that's going on is not so much someone trying to persuade you of something. Mm-hmm. But someone trying to actually silence that person, basically saying that voice is not legitimate. And so he says that what ends up happening when you engage in that type of attack on that silencing attack on people, mm-hmm. is that eventually the narrative in the public square is you can't trust anything that anybody says. Everybody's biased. Nobody is actually speaking for anything other than their own interests. There is really no such thing as objectivity. It's all just opinions. And so you basically have this situation where you can't trust anyone. And if you look right now, you have higher levels of polarization and higher levels of mistrust. Mm-hmm. They're at historic highs, and basically what ends up happening is that the public square it's deflated, and people realize that having a debate, or having an opinion, you can think anything you want to, and you can't trust anything that anybody says. And so, in the political world, we don't trust politicians. And so you end up in this situation where a politician can be totally dishonest, and it's not surprising at all because they're a politician. Yeah. And so you can go ahead and you can plant lies and do all this terrible stuff, and you get away with it because you're a politician, and we know the politicians lie.
Yeah, just expected. Yeah.
But I think we end up doing that. I think that kind of political, these political forms of manipulation are more and more common in other types of public discourse outside of election periods. Mm-hmm. And so you end up with this kind of general kind of sense that you can't trust anything that anybody says. Yeah. And if you take that and you combine it with the sort of this kind of extreme, somebody asks me to write something for a newspaper or something, and it's like no more than 500 words. Yeah. Right. So, and even that's long, right? Yeah. So it's almost like everything's got to be like a short, sound bite. And the fact of the matter is, so many of these issues, you cannot possibly understand them in sound bites. Yeah. And so the YouTube world or the visual world or the soundbite world is not a world that lends itself to sensible problem solving.
Right. The Twitterification of public discourse. 140 characters or not interested.
That's right. And so what ends up happening is that, you start listening to somebody who's going to take a little bit longer to explain something that's more complicated, and you're in the habit of just shutting off. Sure. And so we never get into the gray. We just stay in the black and white. And then that way, and we protect ourselves too. There's a kind of a denial because we all like to look at ourselves as well-informed, sensible, fair-minded. Yep. And so when you act in a way that's none of those, you deny it to yourself, right? And so you end up in this world where the kind of world that we have right now. That's why I think the way out of it is what you see in the Pope's encyclical. And boy, that is a seriously long document.
Yeah, it is.
It's not like a snapshot of, the human relationship with the environment. It's long, but it's incredibly important.
Well, like many, many ideas, the best way to hide them is to put them in a book or an encyclical, because of this impatience that people have. They don't really want to hear the whole case. They just want to fast forward, because everything's a hack, right? Life hack, book hack. Just tell me just the facts, ma'am. Facts defined as the least possible amount of words, because I'm busy. Right. And I'm impatient. There's a lovely poem by W.H. Auden from his book of poetry called The Age of Anxiety. We would rather be ruined than changed. We would rather die in our dread than climb the cross of the moment and let our illusions die. Illusions are diehard. They're much easier to accommodate than brute facts that challenge our basic stance and the views of our tribe. Wow. I love the book. Glad you carved out some time, Jim Hoggan. It's endlessly fascinating. I like that you just come at it from so many different angles. The book's called I'm Right and You're an Idiot, The Toxic State of Public Discourse and How to Clean It Up by James Hoggan. That's Hoggan, Hoggan. And if you go to patrickhoffman.media, I'll be blogging about it and put up a link. You can pick it up. Thanks again, Jim. I really appreciate it.
Well, thank you. I appreciate this as well.
All right. This is The Patrick Coffin Show.